Every empire believes it is different. Every superpower thinks history bends in its favor, and every nation at the height of its strength tells itself the same lie. This time is different. This time, we will not fall. But history doesn't negotiate. It doesn't bargain. It doesn't care about optimism, ideology, or national pride. Because for more than 5,000 years, from the Akkadian Empire to ancient Rome, from the Ottomans to the British Empire, and now the United States, every superpower has followed the same six-stage sequence, a predictable arc of rise, dominance, stagnation, overreach, decay, and collapse. The pattern is so consistent, it's almost mathematical. The names change, the borders change, the technologies evolve, but the internal mechanics, the incentives, the excesses, the blindness remain identical. And here's the part people forget. Empires don't collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they are strongest. When wealth turns into entitlement. When military power becomes a global burden. When the financial system mutates into something too big to sustain. When the currency that once projected confidence becomes the very mechanism of decline. We've seen this before. Rome in the 3rd century. The British Empire after World War I. The Soviet Union in the 1980s. Every time, the same early warning signs appeared, ignored by those living inside the system. And right now, in the 21st century, those same indicators are flashing again. This isn't prophecy. This is pattern, a sequence older than modern finance, older than the nation-state itself. The only question is which stage we're in, and how much time remains before the cycle turns. To understand that, we have to rewind, back to the moment when superpowers first learn how to rise, and unknowingly plant the seeds of their own fall. To understand the rise and fall sequence, we have to go back to the moment when the first great powers emerged, long before the modern state, long before global finance, long before reserve currencies shaped the world, because the cycle does not begin with wealth, it begins with scarcity. Every empire in history rises for the same fundamental reason. Their world becomes unstable. Floods, famine, invasions, collapsing trade routes, fractured city-states. The early human world was built on volatility. Stability wasn't inherited, it had to be manufactured, and the leaders who could impose order on chaos through force, administration, or innovation became the founders of empires. Take the Akkadian Empire, 2300 BC, patchwork of Sumerian city-states locked in endless conflict. Production was high, culture vibrant, but fragmentation made them vulnerable. Then came Sargon of Akkad, a unifier, a conqueror, a system builder. He didn't just raise an army, he created supply chains, taxation systems, and a centralized bureaucracy. From chaos, he carved the world's first empire. Fast forward 2,000 years, Rome rises from a small republic surrounded by hostile tribes. Its early strength wasn't marble, philosophy, or military genius. Those came later. Rome's true advantage was its ability to build institutions, roads, citizenship laws, disciplined legions, and a financial system that allowed the state to mobilize resources at scale. The same pattern unfolded with the Ming Dynasty, the Ottomans, the British Empire, and the United States after World War II. Before each ascent, there was disorder, and each superpower stabilized that disorder with a combination of military security, administrative efficiency, economic innovation, cultural cohesion. This early period, the foundational stage, is where the machinery of dominance is forged. But it's also where the first seeds of eventual decline are planted, because once stability is achieved, something predictable happens. The state expands. To secure borders, it builds armies. To manage armies, it builds bureaucracies. To fund bureaucracies, it builds financial systems. And to fuel those systems, it looks outward, toward trade, resources, and wealth extraction. Expansion is not a choice, it's a structural necessity. Rome expands into Carthage, Gaul, and the Mediterranean. Britain pushes into India, Africa, and the seas. America extends influence through bases, alliances, and the dollar system, and each expansion increases both power and cost. For a while, the trade-off works. Territories generate revenue, trade routes generate taxes, victory creates prestige, but expansion is addictive. And, like all addictions, it comes with a hidden price, a growing dependence on growth itself. As empires stabilize, expand, and accumulate resources, a second transformation happens, subtle, gradual, but fatal. The culture changes. What begins as a society built on discipline turns into a society built on entitlement. What starts as a nation of producers evolves into a nation of consumers. The citizens who once believed in sacrifice begin believing in comfort. And the state, which once lived within its means, begins borrowing from the future. This is the hinge point where the rise becomes the foundation of the fall. But people living inside the system don't see it. They think growth is normal. They believe expansion is permanent. They assume prosperity is structural. And every time in history, this illusion marks the transition to the next phase of the sequence, the point where power transforms from asset to liability. To understand how this shift plays out, we need to examine the empires that lived through it, the ones that rose to heights the world had never seen, and then, inevitably, began to crack. Across history, the clearest way to see the rise and fall sequence is to watch it unfold in three different civilizations: Rome, the British Empire, and the United States. They emerged from different cultures, used different technologies, and ruled in different centuries. Yet the internal logic that shaped them was identical. Their trajectories form a single pattern, stretching across 2,000 years. Rome was the first to reveal the full arc. Its early republic was defined by discipline, austerity, and a relentless military machine fueled not by ideology, but by necessity. Every victory brought land, slaves, and taxes. Every new province funded another army, which conquered another province. It was a feedback loop of expansion and reward that became so normal that Rome forgot it was fragile. The real danger began when Rome won too much. Conquests flooded the Republic with cheap slave labor, collapsing wages for ordinary citizens. Wealth poured into elite families, widening inequality. The military grew so large that it required constant campaigns simply to justify its existence. Tax revenue became dependent on territorial growth, a growth that had physical limits the Romans refused to recognize. When expansion slowed, the financial math broke. Expenses remained enormous. Revenues declined. The state borrowed, debased its currency, debased it again. By the 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius had fallen to almost nothing. Rome didn't collapse because of a single invasion. Invasion was merely the final event in a long sequence of internal decay, triggered by a system that required infinite expansion in a finite world. Centuries later, the British Empire would follow the same logic, but with ships, banks, and global finance instead of legions. Britain's ascent in the 1800s came from productivity and innovation. It industrialized faster than any rival. Its factories, merchants, and naval fleets created the first truly global economic network. The British pound became the world's reserve currency. London controlled the flow of capital across continents. Britain did not just hold territory, it held the world's financial plumbing. But the pattern repeated, just like Rome. Britain's greatest successes created its hidden vulnerabilities. As wealth accumulated, Britain began investing its capital abroad instead of at home. By the late 1800s, nearly half of British wealth was overseas. Industry stagnated. The empire grew more expensive to maintain. Troops, administrators, shipping lanes, and colonial infrastructure consumed the very surplus that once made expansion profitable. Then came World War I. 4 years of industrial warfare forced Britain to borrow heavily, mostly from the rising United States. By the end of the conflict, the empire still appeared powerful, but the foundation had cracked. Debt replaced surplus. The pound lost credibility. Industries lagged behind America and Germany. The empire cost more to govern than it returned in revenue. World War II delivered the finishing blow. Britain won the war militarily, but economically. The empire was over, just like Rome. The peak concealed the fragility already spreading underneath, and then the cycle shifted across the Atlantic. When World War II ended, the United States entered the world stage in the same position Rome had occupied after the Punic Wars and Britain after Waterloo. Dominant, unquestioned, and structurally advantaged, it held half of global GDP. Its factories were untouched. Its currency became the backbone of the international system. Its military could project force anywhere on Earth. The sequence began again. Stability, expansion, global leadership. But within a single generation, the next phase emerged. The U.S. shifted from a nation of producers to a nation of consumers. Trade surpluses became deficits. Gold backing collapsed in 1971. Debt began rising faster than growth. Financial markets inflated far beyond the real economy. Wealth concentrated. Internal cohesion weakened. The cost of global military obligations escalated, echoing the Roman legions and Britain's far-flung garrisons. By the 1990s and 2000s, the same forces that hollowed Britain, financialization, overstretch, dependency on external capital, were now embedded inside the American system. And today, the U.S. at peak faces the same structural constraint every superpower eventually reaches: the requirement to sustain a global order larger, costlier, and more fragile than the nation itself. Different cultures, different centuries, different tools, but the same cycle, the same internal pressures, the same silent mathematical rigidity. And to understand where the United States stands in that cycle today, and how much time remains before the next phase begins, we must break down the mechanics of the system itself. Empires don't rise and fall because of culture, ideology, or personality. Those are surface details. The real force behind every ascent and every collapse is mechanical, a set of structural pressures that accumulate quietly, predictably, and mathematically until the system can no longer sustain itself. Once you understand these pressures, the fall of every superpower stops looking like a surprise and starts looking like an equation. The first of these pressures is the debt cycle. In the early stages of an empire, debt is used sparingly and strategically to build roads, armies, infrastructure, and institutions. Every loan is tied to productive activity. Every investment strengthens the core. But as the empire matures, the purpose of borrowing changes. Debt stops funding growth. It begins funding stability, then comfort, then entitlement. The state borrows to maintain living standards, to finance overseas obligations, to pay for bureaucracies that no longer generate any return. Eventually, it borrows merely to cover the interest on previous borrowing. This is the moment when the debt curve turns exponential, and once it accelerates, no empire in history has been able to reverse it. The second pressure is the military gap, the widening difference between the cost of projecting power and the economic base required to sustain that projection. In the early phase, military expansion brings wealth, plunder for Rome, colonies for Britain, global manufacturing dominance for America after World War II. But over time, maintaining global influence becomes more expensive than acquiring it. Garrisons turn into permanent occupations. Alliances turn into open-ended commitments. Trade routes turn into obligations of protection. The empire becomes responsible for the world's stability, even as its own economy begins to slow. And because global leadership cannot be abandoned without catastrophic consequences, the empire keeps spending long after the math stops working. The third pressure is internal fragmentation. As wealth floods upward, inequality grows, not the simple inequality of rich versus poor, but systemic inequality, where the elite operate in a different economic universe from the citizens they govern. Rome's senatorial class, Britain's merchant aristocracy, America's financialized upper tier, each became so disconnected from ordinary people that the underlying social contract cracked. When the majority no longer believes the system benefits them, political polarization follows. Institutions weaken, governance becomes reactive instead of strategic. The empire begins to act not as a unified entity, but as a fractured one, multiple competing factions trying to steer a ship that once moved with clear purpose. The fourth pressure is currency overextension. The dominant empire's currency becomes the center of global trade, not because it is morally superior, but because it is liquid, stable, and backed by overwhelming power. But reserve currency status is a double-edged sword. It allows the empire to borrow cheaply, import cheaply, and live above its means for decades. Yet the very privilege that sustains prosperity ultimately accelerates decline, because the world's demand for the currency forces the empire to run permanent deficits. Money flows in, manufacturing flows out, the economy financializes. The empire becomes rich in paper and poor in production. This happened to the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and now the US dollar. The fifth pressure is technological disruption. In the early stages, new technology strengthens the empire: Roman roads, British steam power, American computing. But eventually, innovation spreads beyond borders. Rivals catch up. The empire that once controlled the frontier becomes dependent on industries that it no longer dominates. And the new technologies it invents begin empowering competitors who don't carry its legacy costs. The final pressure is entropy, the natural decay that occurs when a system grows larger than its ability to self-correct. Small inefficiencies become large. Minor corruption becomes normalized. Decisions prioritize short-term stability over long-term sustainability. Leaders stop thinking like founders and start thinking like managers of decline. Empires don't collapse because of a single event. They collapse because these pressures converge. Debt accelerates. Military commitments expand. Internal cohesion fractures. Currency dominance decays. Technology escapes control. Governance loses discipline. And then, one external shock, a war, a financial crisis, a monetary shift, a demographic downturn pushes a system already at its limits into irreversible contraction. Rome faced currency debasement and border crises. Britain faced 2 world wars and the rise of the U.S. The United States faces a more complex problem, a world no longer dependent on a single hegemon, combined with debt, demographic stagnation, deglobalization, technological upheaval, and geopolitical multipolarity converging simultaneously. The exact triggers differ. The sequence does not. These pressures are not academic. They are visible, measurable, and unfolding right now, and their alignment reveals exactly where in the cycle America stands today. To make sense of the present, we have to map the pattern directly onto the modern world and see which stage has already begun. The pressures that broke Rome and Britain aren't historical curiosities. They are visible right now, mapped directly onto the structure of the modern United States. What once took centuries now unfolds in decades. What once moved inch by inch now moves at digital speed. For the first time since World War II, every major indicator of imperial strain is flashing at once. Political, financial, demographic, geopolitical. Patterns that once appeared at the end of a long arc are now appearing simultaneously, as if the cycle itself is accelerating. The clearest signal is the debt curve. Used out federal debt past $34 trillion, then $35, then $37 trillion with no credible path towards stabilization. Interest payments alone are larger than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than the GDP of most countries, and unlike previous eras. The problem isn't wartime borrowing or temporary crisis spending, it's structural. The fiscal architecture now requires debt growth simply to avoid contraction. This is not how rising empires behave. It is how late-stage empires behave. At the same time, America's once unquestioned military reach, the very backbone of post-war order, is straining under the weight of multipolar competition. The United States maintains more than 750 bases across dozens of countries, supports alliances from Europe to the Pacific, and sustains a defense system designed for global supremacy, not selective engagement. Yet the economic engine that once backed this footprint is no longer expanding fast enough to support it. For the first time in decades, the marginal cost of maintaining global order is overtaking the marginal benefit. And then there is the internal fragmentation, not just political polarization, but deep structural divergence, 2 economies, 2 social realities, 2 interpretations of the nation itself. Trust in institutions has fallen to historic lows. Congress, the media, the courts, even the military have lost the consensus legitimacy that once held the system together. Like Rome in its later centuries, debate is no longer about policy, but about identity and survival. When nations enter this phase, governance becomes reactive. Short-term stability takes precedence over long-term strategy, and that accelerates decline. The currency dimension tells an equally revealing story. The US dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, but the mechanics underneath that dominance have begun to shift. More than 80% of global trade was once denominated in dollars. That number is now falling as rivals seek alternatives. Yuan settlement in Asia, ruble trade with the Middle East, euro-based energy contracts, and gold accumulation by central banks. A dollar-dominated world is transitioning toward a dollar-dependent world, still shaped by the United States, but no longer controlled by it. And the irony is identical to Britain's experience a century ago. The very privileges that made America powerful have started to erode the foundations of that power. Permanent trade deficits, offshored manufacturing, a financial system bloated far beyond the real economy, a currency that must be printed to sustain domestic consumption while still serving as the world's lifeline. The world needs dollars. America needs to supply them. Supplying them weakens America's industrial base. This is the Triffin dilemma, the mathematical trap that every reserve currency issuer eventually faces. Even the technological domain, long America's greatest moat, now shows the same pattern of diffusion that precedes imperial recalibration. The U.S. still leads in AI, aerospace, biotechnology, and cyber capabilities. But the frontier is no longer exclusively American. China, India, South Korea, and a rising coalition of middle powers now compete in areas that were once unilateral advantages. Innovation is no longer a monopoly, and every empire that loses its monopoly eventually loses its margin. Layered on top of this is a demographic turning point. For decades, America's population growth masked structural weaknesses, but fertility rates have fallen below replacement. Workforce participation has stagnated. Pension obligations grow faster than tax revenues. The age structure that once fueled expansion now demands more from a shrinking base of workers. Meanwhile, global geopolitics has shifted in ways reminiscent of the early 20th century. Not one rising rival, but several. China's economic and military ascent, Russia's territorial reassertion, India's demographic surge, Iran's regional influence, and a network of non-state actors reshaping conflict. The world is no longer unipolar, no longer bipolar. It is fragmented, fluid, and unpredictable, the exact environment where late-stage empires struggle most. What makes the current moment unprecedented is not any single factor. It is the synchronization of all of them. Debt curves rising exponentially, political cohesion collapsing internally, currency dominance weakening gradually, global rivals strengthening simultaneously, technological diffusion reducing strategic advantage, demographic decline increasing fiscal pressure, military burdens expanding faster than resources. This is not prophecy. This is the same sequence that unfolded in Rome, in Britain, in every superpower that believed its era was permanent. But the United States faces an additional challenge those empires did not: a globalized financial system built on real-time signals, algorithmic decision-making, and capital flows that can evaporate in minutes instead of decades. When shocks come to modern empires, they come with digitized speed, faster, harsher, and less reversible. The cycle is not ending. It is entering its next phase. And the only question now is not whether the United States is following the same historical pattern, but how quickly the final stage will unfold. To understand that, we have to examine not the present trajectory, but the acceleration itself, the forces that compress centuries into decades and decades into years. Every empire imagines its decline will be gradual, a long twilight, a controlled retreat, a slow, dignified easing of power, but history shows something different. Decline feels slow while it's happening. But when it resolves suddenly, a snap, not a slide. The pressure builds for decades. The cracks spread quietly. And then, in a moment that seems unexpected, but was inevitable all along, the system moves all at once. Rome looked stable the year before its currency collapsed. Britain looked victorious the year before its empire dissolved. And the United States today looks powerful in all the familiar ways. Carriers on every ocean, a currency in every central bank, markets at all-time highs, a culture that still shapes the world, but power at the top of the cycle is misleading. At the peak, everything looks permanent. That's the illusion. The real story is beneath the surface, in the numbers, in the institutions, in the structural tensions that no military victory and no political slogan can repair, because once the pressures of the imperial cycle align, debt, militarization, fragmentation, currency strain, demographic reversal, the outcome is no longer a matter of if, but when. Decline begins invisibly. Growth slows. Costs rise. Debt accelerates. Polarization intensifies. The currency loses a fraction of its credibility. All of it feels manageable at first, but the system is changing underneath. Each year, flexibility decreases. Each year, commitments expand. Each year, the margin for error narrows. And then something happens. A financial crisis, a geopolitical shock, a technological disruption, a collapse in demand for the reserve currency, and the empire reaches a moment it cannot solve with the tools of the previous era. For Rome, it was the debasement spiral. For Britain, it was 2 industrial wars that exceeded the capacity of its economic base. For the United States, the trigger is still unknown, but the vulnerability is clear. It could be a treasury market freeze, a reserve currency shift, a debt rollover crisis, a geopolitical confrontation that pushes commitments beyond sustainability, a technological leap that levels the playing field, a demographic implosion that breaks the fiscal architecture. The specifics don't matter. The pattern does. Once the pressure reaches a critical threshold, the superpower enters the contraction phase of the sequence, the part no nation has ever escaped. Global commitments shrink, alliances realign, currencies reprice. Institutions lose authority. Domestic conflict intensifies. Wealth concentrates, then evaporates. The living standards that once seemed guaranteed begin to fracture. And through it all, the citizens living inside the system are told that everything is fine, that the center is holding, that the empire is exceptional. But exceptions don't exist in a cycle this old. No empire has outrun the mathematics. No nation has rewritten the sequence. No superpower has broken the pattern of rise, expansion, stagnation, overreach, decline, and reordering. This isn't fatalism, it's structure. Civilizations rise when their internal logic supports growth. They fall when the same logic becomes too heavy to sustain. Every empire rides the wave of its own success until the wave becomes larger than the foundation beneath it. And when the wave breaks, whether through crisis or quiet erosion, the world resets around the new center of gravity. The United States is not collapsing today, but it is moving through the later stages of a cycle that has repeated for 5 millennia. A cycle older than the dollar, older than the Constitution, older than the idea of America itself. And once a superpower reaches this point in the curve, the point where the pressures converge, the commitments outweigh the resources, and the system no longer adapts as quickly as the world around it, the outcome is not something that can be voted away, debated away, or wished away. It is inevitable. History doesn't repeat, it accelerates. And the sequence every superpower follows, the rise, the peak, the overreach, the fracture, and the fall was already in motion. This is the pattern, and we're living inside it.